Hello and welcome to today's lecture. We are going to be talking about James Rachel's article on the case against free will. And a lot of this article is it's going to involve us going through various lines of research, empirical research, which suggests that we don't in fact have free will. Okay, so let's get started. So before we can really understand what we might mean by free will and how modern science challenges the idea that we do have free will, it is worth thinking about the idea of fatalism and determinism. Now, for the purpose of our discussion, by free will, we're going to mean the common sense idea of free will, right? Which is the sense that when you act in a certain way, you could have acted otherwise. So, for example, right now, I have the option to either clap or not clap, right? And it seems like if I clap in the next 5 seconds, I could have not clapped. Or if in fact I decide not to clap, then I could have clapped had I wanted to clap, right? And so free will seems to have this idea that you could do otherwise, and in fact you did, that you're not determined by the previous causes in the past to or determine a unique action, right? So as it turns out, I didn't clap in that time that preceded this, right? But it seems like I could have, right? All right. So with that in mind, let's talk about the difference between fatalism and determinism. So fatalism is a traditional idea which challenges the idea that we have free will, and this is due to Aristotle and I'm sure other ancients, but Aristotle had this exact formulation. But before we talk about the argument for fatalism, let's kind of just think about what fatalism is. So, fatalism is that claim that the future is fixed, and again, fixed in the sense that you cannot act in different ways, contrary to what may think, because every proposition about the future is already true or false. Now, that's going to sound a bit arcane, and that's true, and we'll discuss how this argument is kind of supposed to go. But basically, the idea here is that events in the future, which you might think are open, are actually fixed. So, again, think about some basic um, actions about tomorrow. For example, tomorrow you could decide to eat cereal, right? And it seems like for breakfast. Maybe you're not a person that eats cereal for breakfast. I'm not the person that eats cereal for breakfast. I know I was when I was a child, but I since stopped that practice. But it seems like I could have cereal tomorrow if I wanted to, right? Or maybe something more basic like a particular shirt. It seems like tomorrow, as long as your shirt is available, it seems like you can choose to wear a particular shirt or choose not to wear a particular shirt, right? It seems like the future is open. But according to fatalism, it's not open, it's actually fixed. It's already determined whether you will have cereal tomorrow or not, or whether you're going to wear a particular shirt. It's determined today whether tomorrow that's going to happen. So, how does this argument go? So, it starts with the first premise that every proposition is either true or false. And again, remember our definition of a proposition, namely that it's the kind of statement or claim about the world that is capable of being true or false, right? So, for example, the claim that the wall behind me is blue, that's a proposition, namely the wall behind me is blue, and it's either true or false, right? In this case, it's true. But no, again, propositions can be false, right? For example, the proposition that the wall behind me is orange is also a proposition because it's capable of being true or false. It just so happens to be false, right? And something that is not a proposition, if you recall from our first week of philosophy, was things like questions, right? Or commands, right? If I tell you to close the door, that's not something for which the question of truth arises. So every proposition is either true or false, and that seems to be the case, especially if you think about it in terms of a negation, right? So, for example, either my wall is blue or it's not blue, or it's false that it's blue, right? Um, that's hard to argue against that. No, actually, it's neither blue nor not blue, right? It seems like for every proposition, it must be either the case or not the case. I'm either here recording this video or I am not, right? There doesn't to be any logical space for anything in between. So Aristotle starts from this observation that every proposition is either true or false. It is either true or false. So this is the second premise. It is either true or false that you will wear a blue shirt tomorrow, right? Either you will or you will not wear a blue shirt tomorrow. Okay? Now, consider the first option. If it is true that you'll wear a true shirt, so right now we're saying today, if it is true that tomorrow you will wear a shirt, then you will wear a shirt tomorrow because we're saying that it's true. Like we're assuming that it's true today that you will wear a shirt tomorrow. The fourth premise, though, is the other option. Suppose that it is false. If it is false that you were going to wear a shirt tomorrow, then you will not wear a shirt tomorrow. Why? Because it is false today that tomorrow you'll wear a blue shirt. 5, either way, it is fixed whether you will wear a blue shirt tomorrow or not. Like it's not opened. Oops. Oh, my apologies. And therefore, you actually don't have the freedom to either choose to wear a shirt tomorrow or not if you wanted to. Now, again, maybe it's best again to think about this because I know it can be difficult to understand the logic here. So let's take it very slowly. So again, suppose that it's true right now that you will wear a shirt tomorrow. So that's true. We're assuming that it's true and it can be either true or false. Well, again, if it is true today, so if I can write it down on a piece of paper, it's true that tomorrow you will wear a blue shirt. If it is, and it is true, if that proposition is true, then you will wear a shirt tomorrow. So tomorrow, actually, so it's not open. So today, it's already been determined whether you'll wear a shirt tomorrow, right? Because I just wrote it. It's true. If it is false, and I write it today, you will not wear a shirt tomorrow, or you will wear a shirt tomorrow, and it's false, then you can't tomorrow wear a blue shirt because we have already said that it's false, right? So the question here is, how do we deal with this? How do we deal with this problem? And one ancient way to deal with this problem is actually to deny premise 1, that every proposition is either true or false. And you say, well, how can you do that? Didn't you say that it's almost like obvious that every proposition must be either true or false? That I'm either here or not here? And the question here actually is, the trick is to distinguish propositions about the present and propositions about the future. And propositions about the future are not either true or false. That's the key. So in this case, 1 is false, and so is 2. Because not every proposition is true or false. Only the ones about the present, not the ones that are about the future. And number 2 is false too, for the same reason. Because it's talking about propositions about the future having truth values. And so the way that normally this idea of fatalism gets answers by saying, that's just false. Propositions about the future do not, in fact, have truth values. Okay. But that idea, and this is the way fatalism, in a way, even though it's completely different than determinism, this is where fatalism and determinism are actually much more closely conceptually linked than one might initially think. Because science gives us reasons to think that actually propositions about the future, their truth value can be deduced based on our present conditions. And the basic idea there is that because we know if you know the laws of physics, right? And you know the position of all the particles in the present and all the physical objects, then in principle, you should be able to deduce the positions and the locations of all those physical objects in the future. Think again, like the billiard ball example. If you're about to hit the cue ball to hit a set of billiard balls, and you know in advance on a piece of paper, you know the positions relative to each other of all the balls, including the cue ball, and you know exactly the force that you're going to use to hit the cue ball. You know its weight as well, and you know the exact angle at which you're going to hit the balls. then in principle you can predict how the position of every billiard ball in the future. Even you don't actually need to run the experiment. You can predict it. And the idea is that because of science, because we're physical objects, and because we're all subject to physical laws, in principle, we can determine the future in this way and know the truth values of propositions about various states in the future. So that is like the basic idea behind determinism and why you don't actually have free will. But we're going to draw on different types of evidence to support this idea. And we're going to start with the idea, or rather, evidence from neuroscience. So this work kind of started with this neuroscience. I believe he wrote a book in 1958. Penfield is his name. And he started just by talking, directly stimulating various parts of the brain, and it seemed to produce predictable sensations like the smell of garlic and certain movements in individuals whose brain were being prodded. And this led other scientists or brain scientists to start doing more specific tests to kind of really see how much of our movements that we think are so freely chosen are actually just the product of our brains. After all, that is the deterministic picture, right? If in principle, because your brain is just a collection of physical particles, right? And in principle, if we understand how those physical particles relate, like what one brain state, how it causes another brain state, and how the external stimulus in turn cause particular brain states, then, and our actions are the result of brain states, then in principle we should be able to predict how people act just based on the stimulus that they're receiving from their environment. And so it's a perfect deterministic explanation. And so this led to another neuroscientist whose name is Delgado. And he started stimulating patient or participants' brains, which induce what you can call complex or coordinated actions like frowning or movement of the head and arms, like looking or even looking down underneath the table, right? And again, it became predictable. Like the guy realized that if I prod this particular part of the brain, then this particular behavioral outcome will be carried out, right? And maybe let's pause there for a second. So again, so what is the evidence here? So here I am one of Delgado's participants, and he pokes a particular part of my brain, or actually not pokes it, he's using electrical stimulation. And once he does that, I kind of engage in some sort of behavior that we normally would interpret as intelligible. But you might say, I don't know, does that actually challenge free will? Like, isn't that more so like somebody who's just trying to manipulate your behavior, like more like a puppet? And a puppet doesn't have free will, right? In any particular sense. Or so isn't that more that they're just causing you to move in a particular way? Like those are not actual actions that you're doing from your free will, but rather they're more the effects, right? It's more like um, it would be more like when you twitch, right? Or when you hit your funny bone and you move. It's more like a quick response to a particular stimulus, right? Or when you hit your knee and your knee goes up. Isn't But we don't call that an action, right? Remember, actually, and this fits well within the philosophy of Kant. Remember that for Kant, the difference between an action and a movement in space is that the action is performed for a reason, right? The difference between me just moving around, right, and me actually acting is that my action has an intention behind it. There's a reason why I get up, right? I'm not just being pulled by strings, right? And so you can say those are not actions. Those are just movements in space which are being caused by the electrical stimulation, right? And that might seem to be the case, but here's the thing. The interesting part is that the subjects even confabulated reasons for these actions, or they interpreted their actions as being performed for reasons. So what does this look like? So this is one description from one of the participants, right? So they had head turning and slow displacement of the body to either side with a well-oriented and apparently normal sequence, as if the patient were looking for something, right? So I get the stimulus and I start looking down, right, for whatever reason. And so that looks like I'm acting for a reason. And in fact, the researchers asked the patient, "What are you doing? Like, why are you moving in this way?" And the patient actually gave reasons for their action. They would reply something like, "I'm looking for my slippers. I heard a noise. I am restless. Or I was looking under my bed." So they were interpreting their actions as being performed by reasons, as intelligible, right? When they were engaging in these behaviors. So this might lead us to think that they are in fact actions. Could we resist this? Well, it seems like perhaps. So here's where I think one way of resisting this is that whole, we just said how maybe this is just the result of being stimulated, right? In the same way that a twitch. And it's not obvious to me why this entire sequence cannot actually be construed in the same way. So there, when I get, or when these participants were getting their brain stimulated and they were responding with reasons, it's not clear to me why that entire response, including verbally using reasons, was just not part of the effect of the stimulus, right? It was just a very sophisticated form of effect, but it's not clear to me that the way that people were speaking in this way is just not part of the effect. Let me put it another way. We Everybody has, or we can all conceive of the person being stimulated and then they kind of engage in this behavior, right? And we're saying, oh no, that in itself is just the cause, right? It's not actual action. Well, I feel like we can say the same story about them even reproducing the verbal cues as still being part of this long effect of the brain stimulation. So in fact, they're not acting for reasons. They're just, the effects are just the verbal affirmation of reasons, if that makes sense. So that's, I think, the most plausible way that one can resist this evidence. Let's continue then. Okay, so Kornhuber performed again, and this is another neuroscientist, some experiments which seem to suggest that voluntary movement begins before conscious awareness of deciding. Okay, so how does this look like? So what he did is that he hooked up his participants again to be able to scan their brains or to look at their brains in real time. And they basically asked them to decide to perform certain actions, like moving your finger, let's just say for the sake of argument. And according to Kornhuber, it seemed like the person, before they even decided to move their finger, you can already see the pattern in their brain, like the causal parts of their brain starting before they even decided to actually move their finger. So the way that they want to tell us this, and I think I believe I actually have a, one second. Okay, so let's just go through what I have here. So just so we are all on the same page. So suppose you sit quietly and sometime during the next minute, you spontaneously move your finger. Well, this is the way they want us to think that, or what this experiment shows. Subjectively, you may feel quite certain that the decision to move your finger was entirely within your control, right? If we're all sitting here and I say, okay, you know what? Take a minute and decide whether you move your finger or not. And it seems like you're in control. Like, I'm in control right now to move my finger. Look, I did. And I could have not done it, right? That's the thumbs up. But they suggest that when you look at my brain and I decide to move my finger, it actually shows up before, right? And in particular, it shows up 1.5 seconds before the movement. And it begins before you make your decision, apparently. And if that's the case, then this is an illusion. It is an illusion that I'm choosing to move my finger because 1.5 seconds beforehand, they can already see that I am going to move my finger. And so the decision to move my finger is an illusion, according to them. It's just predetermined by my brain activity. How shall we respond to this? Well, one way that you can resist this is maybe to suggest that maybe your decision, the time it takes for me to form the decision and to execute it is just longer than we think, right? And what the brain activity is picking up on 1.5 seconds before, which is not long, is just my free decision to decide to move my thumb, right? So I decide, and then it just takes kind of like 1.5 seconds for me to actually move my finger. Like I kind of have decided 1.5 seconds before I move it, right? And my brain can already tell subconsciously what I'm about to decide. But in that case, that doesn't show that I don't have free will necessarily. It just shows that the action between my mind deciding and my movement is just slower than we think, perhaps, right? So I also believe that this evidence, which Rachel James, can be resisted. All right, let's move on to evidence from psychology and behavior. So just this is more common sense determinism, or what we can call soft determinism, and this just comes from the obvious observation that parents, the one's parents or upbringing, or like our socioeconomic conditions, can clearly shape who we become, right? Like this is more like the determinism of our environment. And of course, we kind of know this, right? There are numerous studies that suggest that if a parent reads to their child even just 15 minutes per night when they're infants, then that is a big predictor of the child's success in life, right? So we're familiar with this idea. For example, and James Rachels brings up this idea of Eric Rudolph, and he is the Birmingham bomber, right? Who bombed a hospital because he was against abortion, and he killed a doctor and wounded a nurse, right? So this is a very famous case of a terrorist attack, or what it was considered a terrorist attack at that time, namely because it was like it had a political goal. But when you read, or as James Ratio suggests, when you kind of look into Eric's upbringing, how he lost his dad, he was brought up in a white nationalist community, where he was even writing essays when he was in middle school denying the Holocaust. Like at that point, think about it. For you to write a essay denying the Holocaust in middle school, from all the propaganda that you have been inculcated with, then it seems to suggest that he was very much indoctrinated at such a young age that, according to Rachels, he says, "Are we really surprised that he ended up doing something so extreme? Could he have done otherwise than he in fact did? Maybe." And this becomes more difficult, right? At the extent to which one's upbringing is that deterministic about our actions, right? All right. Oops. Here are some interesting experiments which Rachels brings up from social psychology. And these are interesting because what they show is that we are influenced, and we are influenced more by our circumstances than we might think. And yes, let's just go through the examples, and then we'll briefly talk about how they relate to free will. So Zimbardo's prison experiment. So this is just an experiment, I believe, at a particular university where you had a group of people, participants, and they were randomly split into two kinds of groups. One were assigned the role of guards, and the other group were assigned the role of inmates. And the experiment, I believe, was supposed to run through for 2 weeks, where they just pretended. So the inmates had to stay in this fake cell, and the guards were just playing the role of the guards. Now, what happened in this experiment is that the people that were playing the guards role became very abusive towards the prisoners, even though they knew, like, this is not real, this is fake, they're not real criminals. Not that that should justify their behavior, but even then, they understood that they, in principle, could have been the prisoners, right? Because it was randomly assigned. And yet they became so abusive towards the inmates, or the people that were playing the prisoners, that they actually had to cancel the experiment after only 1 week. And so this leads the at least the theorist to suggest that actually people are very much influenced heavily by their environment. This environment playing the role of the guard, and maybe to a certain extent, maybe the social norms or expectations or beliefs about these roles. What's interesting too is that when they interviewed the participants that were playing the inmates or the prisoners, they thought that they had been the guards, they would have never acted in this way, right? That they would not have been abusive towards the inmates, right? They would have been kind. But of course, that's the interesting thing is that there's a certain kind of delusion there because they were randomly assigned. Like probably they would have just been as abusive as the other people, right? And so there's also this interesting idea about not merely that we seem to be determined by circumstances in our environment, but that we are just so unaware of that influence. Similarly, Milgram's obedience experiments. This very basically, maybe you've come across this experiments. Milgram's experiments are consisted in just having participants come into a room with an expert, or so-called expert, somebody just with a white coat. And what they would do is they would their job was to press a button that that shocked somebody else in a different room. That and what they had to do was increase the degree of shock or the level of the shock, and shock them. So they started at a low level, and they would just shock the person in the other room. And what would happen is that when so the expert tell them, okay, increase by 1 volt or whatever. I don't remember the unit of increase, but increase the degree of shock. So they would increase it, and they would start hearing the person in the other room that they were shocking. Like every time they would press the button, they would at first they start grunting because the levels were low. But as they begin to increase it, the person in the other room started screaming like "ow" and "help," and it got really bad. So they were like screaming for help when they were getting the shock. And what's remarkable is that most of them not only went all the way up to the part where the person was screaming, but even afterwards, when they increased it even more, the participant in the other room stopped screaming. Like he went like it got to a level where it was like help, help, and then they increased it, and then they hit it, and they didn't hear anything. Like supposing that the person had passed out, right? Now, obviously, there's nobody actually being shocked. It was all fake, right? But from the participants' perspective, they didn't know that, and it was very realistic. And so again, remarkable that people I believe it was 95% of people went all the way up to the highest levels. And again, when we look at this, we go, oh, we would never, right? We would never do that. But again, this experiment has been carried out multiple times, and it just seems like the kind of thing that we would be capable of. Now, in this one, the theory is that it's just our bias towards obedience or expertise. Because the doctor or the expert in that room is just telling us to keep going, and they have like a very somber face, then that seems to be enough to produce the bias in us to continue, right? But whatever it may be, that is still a very arbitrary factor just for somebody in a white lab coat to tell you to do something. That's extremely arbitrary. Clearly, and do something that clearly we know it's wrong, right? Okay, one more. The Good Samaritan experiment, and this experiment was carried out in Princeton Theological Seminary. And what happened in this case was that a group of students, the theology students, were asked to write a sermon on the Good Samaritan. If you're familiar with the Good Samaritan story from the Bible, this is a parable which Jesus tells about I believe, a Jewish person who is beaten by thieves and left to die on the side of the road. And a Pharisee comes, who's a religious leader, very prominent, right? And he comes by and he doesn't help him. He just goes over to the other side of the road and keeps going. Then a Levite, I believe, is the second person that comes. Also somebody who is supposed to have a religious significance in because the priests come from the Levites. But the Levite also looked away and did not help the person in need. And then a Samaritan comes, right? And a Samaritan, Jewish people and Samaritans did not get along for various reasons. One of the reasons was the Samaritans were kind of like came from a mixed race, but they also had differences about their beliefs as well. And so they didn't get along for various reasons. But the Samaritan helped the person, the Jewish man who had been beat up, and like cared for him and even paid for his paid the doctor to take care of him. And so the idea is that you have to be a good Samaritan. You have to help those in need, even if you disagree with them, or even if they despise you. Quite frankly. Okay, so that's the moral of the story. So these theological students had to tell this. They had to preach a sermon on the Good Samaritan, and the two groups were split up in this following sense. So there was two groups, and they were both told to make a sermon about the Good Samaritan and deliver it in another part of the seminary. The only difference was that one group was not given much time to do this, so they were in a hurry. Well, the other two had plenty of time, and could take their time going to the other building to deliver the sermon. And what's interesting is that the researchers, what they did is that on the way to the place where they were going to deliver the sermon, they had somebody play the role of an injured and somebody in grave need, right? I believe they're like on the floor and they were like really expressing pain and suffering. And what happened was that so we would think, oh, okay, those people that are more compassionate are more likely to stop and help this person before they go to deliver their sermon. But in fact, that wasn't the case. What the determining factor as to whether people actually helped this person out was just whether they were running, they were in a hurry or not because of the differences in time frame. So the group that was not given much time, they did not stop to help the person. Only the group that was given more time. So the determining factor was just that. It was time, like something external. It wasn't their virtue, right? Now, interestingly enough, so what do we make of all these experiments from social psychology? It's so James Rachels raises this in the context of his article, the title of which is The Case Against Free Will. But it's hard to understand, perhaps. I mean, you can kind of see why it would undermine our idea of free will, but again, if we really dig down, it's, at least to my mind, it doesn't really undermine, at least not these cases, undermine whether people have free will. It perhaps undermines or are the extent to which we think we're really virtuous, right? And or rational. Um, because it suggests that actually we're influenced to perform actions which are not good or to perform actions which are bad by external arbitrary factors, right? But those arbitrary factors are still factors, right? Like the person who is running to deliver their sermon that's running late, is not that they're less free because they did not help the person, is because time seems to have played a strong role in their deliberative process as a reason not to help that person. Again, not a virtuous decision, right? But it seemed to be a free decision nonetheless. I personally don't see how these examples undermine the idea of free will because these individuals seem to be acting for reasons. They just seem to be acting for bad reasons. But again, if the main claim here is that this undermines our free will, then I'm not sure that it actually does. It does raise some interesting questions about, again, the degree to which we're virtuous and maybe not so virtuous as we think we are. But it's hard to believe that or see how this really undermines our deliberative capacities altogether. All right. Now the last set of research to which Rachel appeals comes from genes and behavior, which again is really interesting. And in particular, Rachel's focuses on twin studies. And identical twin studies are studies where you take identical twins that were raised apart. That's really important because if they're raised together, then you can always explain these similarities in terms of the environment. So it's really important that they were raised apart as babies and when they're adults. But when they brought them back together, I believe it was the University of Minnesota, when they're brought back together and they they discovered all these really peculiar similarities, right? And here are some examples of these discoveries. The first were the so-called giggle sisters, and they were called this way because they both happened to laugh all the time. Okay, that's that's a similarity, but they also had some other similarities. They both had the habit of pushing on their noses, which they both called squidking. So they both named this interesting habit the same interesting name, which it's pretty peculiar. And they both claim to have weak ankles as a result of falling when they were 15. Again, very peculiar similarity. And both had met their husbands at dances when they were in high school. Sorry, I forgot, I left out that part there. So when they were in high school. So again, a very unique similarity that the odds that two individuals would have these similarities in a given population are pretty low, let alone that they're siblings, right? So it seems to strongly suggest that these peculiar behaviors are the result of their genetics, right? Oh, and they both had worked as polling clerks. All right, so here's another case. Two brothers who were named Jim, they drove the same model car, they smoked the same brand of cigarettes. Both had elaborate workshops at home where they made miniature furniture as a hobby. That's probably the most interesting similar fact that they share. Because what are the odds of anybody, quite frankly, having a hobby of making miniature furniture? I don't know anybody who does that. Maybe you do. But again, it's not merely the odds that any two people have this, is that they are brothers, right? Or identical twins. So it seems to suggest that it was the genes that determined this particular hobby, again, especially because they grew up apart, like under completely different circumstances. And they both like to leave little love notes for their wives lying around the house. Again, a very peculiar behavior. Oh, and they had named their sons James Allen and James Allen. So they're only off by a letter, not even a syllable, because they both sound the same, right? And this raises the question: well, are some people born bad, right? Because that's really the issue that we have. Like the issue of free will concerns whether humans are responsible for what they do, right? That is our main concern. It seems like those peculiarities that we just described, I mean, they're really peculiar, but if that's what all genetics determine, like certain proclivities, then that wouldn't be a big deal. What about like actually being born bad, right? And evidence links genetics and neural structures to particular, what we would call moral traits like aggression, impulsivity, risk taking, insensitivity to others' feelings. Um, but, and I guess I'm going to just have this here. It seems to me like this does not imply that people are hopeless or that the environment does not matter, right? Clearly, and this is Rachel's, I think, also brings this up. Even if we do have a different distribution between these traits among people, it doesn't mean that they're fully determined. It just means that some people have biological factors that make them less likely to act good. But in fact, and this goes back actually to Kant, there's a sense in which even that makes their actions all the more impressive. So according to Kant, in his groundwork, he contrasts and between two people, right? Remember that according to Kant, the morally right action is the one that is performed out of duty, right? And that's a categorical principle. The principle, the reason for which you're acting is because it is a good motive, right? It is the right thing to do. And he says that action actually is praiseworthy as opposed to the person who is naturally sympathetic. A person who it has inclination to be sympathetic, right, is probably more likely to help out more than the person who's just naturally selfish. But isn't there a sense, and Kant will kind of suggest this, in which it's more impressive for the person who is not sympathetic to act kindly towards others against their biological dispositions than the person who's just naturally comes to act sympathetically? Yeah, there seems to be an idea there that the person for whom it is more difficult is actually more impressive and morally worthy. And even perhaps more, according to Kant, the reason why we don't praise the actions of the person who's naturally inclined because of their sympathy is actually because they're acting on the exact same principle of action as the serial killer or the vicious person. Well, why? because the vicious person is acting out of their strongest inclinations, and so is this naturally sympathetic person, right? They are ultimately determined by their inclinations and their psychologies. That's why for Kant, those are equally not praiseworthy. The naturally sympathetic person and the naturally vicious person are both acting on their inclinations. They have no control over their actions, really. And that's why for both, for Kant, neither have moral worth. Rather, it is the one who exemplifies control over their biology no matter what and actually acts for the right reasons, right? So, in that sense, this fits really well with Kant's philosophy. All right, so that finishes this lecture on free will, and our next lecture will be on a little bit more on moral responsibility. Thank you for listening.